Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I like to pick up on a comment made by new Cabinet Minister Esther McVey, otherwise known as the Minister for Common Sense, who said that there should not be cheap labour coming into the UK. Now, this was, of course, the main plank of Brexit, or one of them. However, it's worth noting that EU rules do not mean cheap labour comes into any member states, but more importantly, the Tories' post-Brexit immigration rules mean that this is actually going to happen way more often, not less. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So, question time was in my hometown of Doncaster yesterday, and I've seen a few beauties clipped, but one stood out for me. Esther McVey, the dim-witted Minister for Common Sense. Very much on a par with making Nadine Dorries Culture Secretary. She claimed, oh, of course we shouldn't be bringing in cheap foreign labour. Yet this is exactly what her government are doing. But let's go back a few years. As a driving force of Brexit, a misconception was promoted by the pro-Brexit news that British employers could just hire staff for lower wages from EU member states like Poland. Oh, I don't want to pay these British workers, I'll get foreign staff for less money. This wasn't actually true. You couldn't do this. If you saw anyone doing it, they were breaking the law. The rules in the UK have been that if a business cannot find staff, it's advertised for staff, can't get them. So the staff are not available locally, say. Then they can recruit foreign workers to do those jobs at less than the going rate. Now, EU rules do not, that's not an EU rule. EU rules don't insist on that. That was a UK rule. In fact, EU rules insist that you cannot just pay someone less because they're from another country. UK domestic law, which allowed under any circumstances foreign workers, but it was under very specific conditions, to be paid less than the going rate. But I emphasised that certain conditions had to be met. You couldn't just pay foreign workers less in general. The sovereign member decides its own rates of pay because that doesn't give them a competitive advantage. That is a matter that's entirely for that government. For example, at the start of 1997, we were EU members. The EU had formed several years before. We were full EU members. Start of 1997, there was no minimum wage. So the government wasn't setting rates of pay. So employers could pay as much or as little as they liked, assuming they could get the people to do the work for that salary. Then Labour came in. They introduced the minimum wage. The Tories opposed it. It was never the case that any worker, foreign or domestic, could ever be paid less than that minimum wage legally once it was implemented. If it was ever happening, and it does, it was against the law and could be reported. So if you've got people I've had people say to me, oh, I knew this fella paid foreign workers below the minimum wage. And it's like, and you didn't report it? Well, no, because EU rules. No. You are allowing it. It's not the EU allowing that. The EU didn't allow it. Neither did the UK. You've allowed it by observing it and not reporting it to the authorities. And it still happens now outside the EU. It was the case, as I said, that if you struggle to fill vacancies, you could pay below the going rate for workers, but not below the minimum wage. Now, before I come on to the comment from Minister for Common Sense, it's worth looking at the situation now, because you think to yourself, well, we've now had Brexit. Surely, if it was all down to the EU, things have changed. Well, yes and no. No, as in, it is still very much the case that if a business owner says that they struggle to find workers, they can hire migrant workers on below the going rate. In fact, as little as 70% of the going rate. And yes, things have changed in that the reduction possible has been increased, and it applies to a wider field of potential recruits. The government have made it harder to get skilled workers from Europe, but easier to get them from Africa or Asia. This is why immigration from the EU is down and that from Africa and Asia is way up. In fact, one easy way, because it is awkward to get visas. We know that there's vacancies all over the country because it's now hard to get visas. One of the easiest ways to get a visa, ironically, is to claim that you need to pay below the going rate. So actually, this rule now makes it easier to bring in foreign workers at below the going rate, because it's a nice, easy way to get that visa. In other words, if you didn't like the idea of hiring foreign workers at lower rates before, well, a couple of things to point out. First, it's way worse now. And second, the rules weren't what you thought they were in the EU. If you saw foreign workers being paid less for work that people in the local area would have done, what you were watching was not EU rules in action, but employment laws being broken. And what did you do about it? Was it nothing? So that's why it was happening. So now let's come to McVey's comment. She said we should not be getting in cheap labour coming to the UK. But she's in government and the rule exists. It didn't have to exist as EU members. It doesn't have to exist now. Labour have said they will scrap that rule, that you don't get to pay below the going rate just because you claim you can't hire without doing so. So ask yourselves why the Tories haven't done what Labour have committed to do. It's not because they haven't got around to it. It's not because it's complicated. They implemented their post-Brexit immigration system some time ago. It needed legislation. Why didn't they scrap this rule at the time instead of just expanding it? Would have been easy. It's like an amendment. It would take an official, like, not even a full afternoon to sort that out. They didn't do it because they didn't want to. Brexit was pushed exclusively by multimillionaires and billionaires. Consider that. Exclusively by multimillionaires and billionaires in order to persuade people that threats to their standard of living existed, which did not, and that only they would protect them. Like, in what sort of world does a struggling worker really believe that only the multimillionaires and billionaires are looking out for their interests? In fact, what's actually happened with Brexit is that salary protections have been abolished. Remember, the rule that you cannot pay someone less just because they're from another country, that is an EU rule, not a UK rule. The Brexiteers in Parliament, like Priti Patel and Jacob Rees-Mogg, they have been arguing that we should abolish all EU rules, as they call them. That includes this one. In fact, I think this one may actually be going in the retained EU Law Act later this month. Remember how they accidentally scrapped equal pay for women and had to put it back quickly before it comes into force at the end of this month? Well, I think the equal pay for nationalities has gone through. Don't quote me, it's all very tedious to really check. But the point is that either that EU rule has gone or there are Tories wanting it gone. And there is no equivalent in UK law if it does. In fact, I'm going to give a shout out to Jim Grace here, who tweeted a bit of a thread on this topic recently. We'll post a link in the description below. Sets out how the Tories, far from stopping British employers from hiring cheap foreign labour, which was very rarely possible in the EU, have actually made the practice much easier. It'll be more commonplace. This means that the future of Tory Britain, unless we change it, is for it to be easier to undercut British workers. We already have an immigration system that forces British workers into low-paid jobs because it's really very easy to get a visa for a well-paid job. Any job that pays above a certain threshold, which is going up to 40,000, it's easy to get. You can get almost all the points just from that. Very easy to get the visas for that. So in other words, there's a lot of competition for what are considered well-paid jobs because you're competing with everyone, not in Europe, around the world. But very little competition for the very low-paid jobs. So it's forcing British workers into low-paid jobs. And the British workers who oppose this concept of cheap foreign labour have voted for it on at least 2 occasions in 2016 and 2019. And this is what really irritates me about not just Brexit, but Tory policies in general. See, when they get away with describing something which isn't just untrue, but the polar opposite of true. Of course we shouldn't bring in cheap labour to the UK. That's what your government's doing though. It's your rules allowing us to do so. You've changed the rules to make it easier to do so. You could have stopped it in all its forms. As EU members, you didn't. You could have done it outside the EU. You didn't. You've actually expanded the concept. In fact, while we're on the subject of the Tory immigration rules, and I've just talked about that threshold, must give another shout out to the lady in Doncaster, I don't know her name, the Doncaster audience, who made reference to the fact the government want to raise the threshold for the definition of what is a good job in the visa rules to £40,000 a year. She said it was interesting that there's a £40,000 threshold for migrants when we can't even pay junior doctors that, which is quite right. The government are yet again defining nursing, medicine, teaching, policing, any number of other highly trained key professions as not good jobs. Because that is what they're calling. They've set a threshold for what they consider a good job, and it's based on pay, right? They've set that. So anyone earning below that, anyone earning below 40,000, as far as the Tories are concerned, you've not got a good job. What does that tell you about their commitment to vital public services? But that's a slightly separate point. The main point is, on economic migration, as on so much else, Brexit was based on telling people about a reality which did not exist, but, in a cruel stroke of irony, has now created that reality. That reality is now true. The thing that got people to vote Brexit, oh, we want to stop this reality, it wasn't reality, but it is now. It was never the case that employers could legally employ cheap labour in the EU, but they can now. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.